Sins. An Indian Manifesto is a 1969 nonfiction book by the lawyer, professor and writer Vine Deloria Jr. The book was noteworthy for its relevance to the Alcatrazard power movement and other activist organizations, such as the American Indian movement, which was beginning to expand. Deloria's book encouraged better use of federal funds aimed at helping Native Americans. Vine Deloria Jr. presents Native Americans in a humorous light, devoting an entire chapter to Native American humor. Custer Died for Your Sins was significant in its presentation of Native Americans as a people who were able to retain their tribal society and morality, while existing in the modern world. Vine Victor Deloria Jr. March 26, 1933 – November 13, 2005, Standing Rock Sioux was an author, theologian, historian, and activist for Native American rights. He was widely known for his book Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto 1969, which helped attract national attention to Native American issues in the same year as the Alcatraz Red Power movement. From 1964 to 1967, he served as executive director of the National Congress of American Indians, increasing its membership of tribes from 19 to 156. Beginning in 1977, he was a board member of the National Museum of the American Indian, which now has buildings in both New York City and in Washington, D.C., on the Mall. The book consists of 11 essays and is critical of aid organizations, churches, and the U.S. government, for their efforts to help Native Americans, which often hinder rather than help progress. Deloria also objects to the efforts of anthropologists to understand Native Americans, devoting millions of dollars to the study of individual tribes that would help the tribes to advance themselves. The book advocates Native American religion, and encourages church groups to lay aside their theological differences and help the tribes whose members they sought to convert. Essays. Indians Today, The Real and the Unreal. Deloria pointed out numerous beliefs and attitudes that affect Native American-white relations. He noted that many whites claim Indian ancestry, usually by a grandmother who was an Indian princess, and Riley noted that tribes were evidently entirely female for the first 300 years of white occupation. The essay goes on to list many other myths about Native Americans. Laws and treaties. While noting that U.S. presidents continually stress the need to meet its treaty obligations with foreign powers, they have had over 400 treaties with Native American tribes and have yet to meet their obligations on any of them. Deloria saw the Vietnam War as just another example of the lack of integrity in the American government. The disastrous policy of termination. This chapter covered the termination policy of the 1950s, designed to assimilate tribal members into white society. Deloria believed that this was just another way for whites to obtain Native American land. Anthropologists and other friends. Deloria recommended that Native Americans not cooperate with anthropologists, believing that they exploited Native Americans in order to further their own academic careers. He stated that they compiled useless knowledge and noted that not one anthropologist stepped forward during termination hearings. He stated that, behind each policy and program with which Indians are plagued, if traced completely back to its origin, stands the anthropologist. Missionaries and the religious vacuum. The role of Christian churches was also attacked, with Deloria advocating a return to traditional religion and an expansion of the Native American church. Government agencies. Deloria advocated a restructuring of the Bureau of Indian Affairs (BIA) with more discretionary funds available to the tribes. He also recommended moving BIA from the Department of the Interior to the Department of Commerce. Indian humor. This is the most often quoted section of the book. 1. Deloria noted that humor was a critical aspect of social control in tribal relationships, as an alternate means of pointing out flaws and errors without a direct confrontation that would affect the dignity of the accused. 1. He also noted that humor was an essential part of a tribe's survival, preventing them from going to extremes. The red and the black. Deloria noted the similarities of the oppression of both Native Americans and African Americans, but also pointed out differences between the two. While oppression against African Americans typically excluded them from white society, oppression against Native Americans typically involved the forced inclusion into white society. Deloria believed that this was due to the white desire to appropriate and exploit Native American lands and resources. He also noted that this is one of the reasons that Native Americans did not participate fully in civil rights efforts in the 1960s, believing that the liberals did not understand Native American nationalism. The problem of Indian leadership. Deloria addresses the lack of central leadership of Native Americans and the trouble that has caused. He compares specifically to the number of leaders seen during the civil rights era and laments at the absence of comparable Native figures. Indians and modern society. Deloria uses this chapter as a response to those individuals who believe that Native Americans have no place in modern society as they are. Specifically with tribalism as the central point of contention. Deloria argues that tribalism is so inherent to the Native identity that it will one day lead them to do things once thought impossible by Indian and non-Indian alike. A redefinition of Indian affairs. In his final chapter, Deloria advocates for the end of termination and the start of a new era for American Indians. Deloria reflects the civil rights movement and suggests that it is a spot natives can find inspiration for their own movement. Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian manifesto, was based on a bumper sticker and a Native American slogan from the 1960s, "We shall overrun." The book was significant at the time of its publication, as the struggle for minority rights was gaining increased attention across the United States. Due to its importance in the Red Power movement, an original copy of the book was displayed in the National Museum of the American Indians long-term exhibit, Our Lives, Contemporary Life and Identities. The book caused anthropologists to rethink how they approach their studies of Native American tribes. It remains one of the most significant nonfiction books written by a Native American. Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto is a 1969 work of polemical nonfiction by the Native American author, theologian, and activist Vine Deloria Jr. Deloria's Manifesto sets out the nature of white America's oppression and exploitation of Native people, explores the history of Native resistance, and recommends a course of action for Native American activists. Extremely influential in the burgeoning Native American movement and other Native American activist groups, Custer Died for Your Sins remains a key text in Native American studies. The first of the book's 11 essays, Indians Today, The Real and the Unreal, serves as an introduction, setting out the various erroneous beliefs and stereotypes which govern the terms of white Americans' relations to Native people. While Deloria's style is polemical, he is also wryly humorous. Noting that most whites who claim Native ancestry seem to claim descent from an Indian princess, Deloria ironically postulates that Native tribes must have been all female for the first 3 centuries of white occupation. The first half of the book explores various ways in which white America has attempted to destroy Indian culture. Deloria focuses with particular vehemence on the Indian termination policy of the 1940s and 1950s, which attempted to eliminate altogether the last vestiges of support for the tribes from the federal government and complete the work of assimilating Native people. Deloria points out that assimilation had been the unspoken agenda of the federal government throughout American history. In 2 essays, Deloria focuses on the role of anthropologists and missionaries, 2 white groups that he portrays as false friends to Native America. He argues that Native people should cease cooperating with anthropologists, who, in his view, exploit Native Americans to further their own careers, displaying little or no enduring concern for Native life. He notes that not a single anthropologist spoke at the termination policy hearings. Indeed, he concludes, behind each policy and program with which Indians are plagued, if traced completely back to its origin, stands the anthropologist. Deloria sees missionaries as similarly self-serving, and he argues that in place of cooperation with missionaries, Native activists should advocate a return to traditional religion and an expansion of the Native American Church. The first half of the book closes with an examination of the federal government agencies created to manage Indian affairs, arguing that their ultimate goal was to destroy Indian culture. The second half of the book examines ways in which Native Americans have resisted white America's attempts to suppress Native culture. In the book's most famous essay, Indian Humor, Deloria examines the self-deprecation and irony, which he sees as defining Native humor. He argues that this kind of oblique joking was an essential component of Native tribal society, because it allowed critique without direct confrontation. He argues that humor has been a key survival strategy for Native people, providing them with a relatively safe outlet for the rage and frustration engendered by white oppression. Another key essay, The Red and the Black, analyses in detail the differences between the political situations of Native and African Americans, suggesting ways in which the struggle for Native rights can imitate the civil rights movement, and ways in which it must differ if it is to be successful. Deloria notes that while the history of Black America is one of exclusion, the history of Native America is one of forced inclusion. He traces this difference to the whites' desire to appropriate Native land and other resources. The next chapter focuses on the concept of leadership in Native culture. Pointing out that leadership functions very differently in Native and white societies, he traces the historical and social reasons for the difference. He argues that the Native approach to leadership has sometimes caused problems for Native resistance. The next chapter turns to a practical recommendation for the future, calling for a redefinition of Indian affairs. In the final chapter, Deloria steps to the fore to explain his motives in writing the book. Noting that he expects a backlash, he sets out his hope for a successful Native rights movement.